September-October 1943. The Atlantic is a body of steel teeth. U-boats strike in the night, and convoys vanish by dawn. An invisible new weapon slices swathes through escort screens, a torpedo that listens. The Allies scramble. Scientists, sailors, and engineers race to stop a noise that hunts by sound. The answer will not come from an admiral's office alone, but from desperate men on tired ships who begin to improvise. Some stories will name a cook, an everyman who tried a wild idea, and that myth will travel. The confirmed historical line is simpler and stranger. A towed acoustic noisemaker, crude, noisy, effective, was hurried into service and turned the tide against the T-5G7's acoustic homing torpedoes. The autumn of 1943 begins as a shock. German U-boats introduce a torpedo that hunts by sound. The G-7E's T-5, nicknamed the Gnat by Allied crews, is different. No longer a straight runner, but a seeker. Launched from a U-boat into the black, it listens for the thunder of propellers and homes in on the loudest signature, often the escort vessel closing to defend the convoy. Within weeks, escorts and merchantmen report a new pattern of losses. Torpedoes slam into sterns and into the flanks of destroyers that think themselves safe. Alarm spreads through convoy planning rooms. The technical community recognizes a harsh truth. Allied vessels' own noise, engine bearings, shaft cavitation, has become a beacon. Experts in labs and workshops move fast, but so do the crews afloat, improvising with what they have. The Allies respond not with a single miracle, but with a set of overlapping solutions: tactics, electronic counters where possible, and, crucially, a towed acoustic noisemaker that would drown the torpedo's ear. This device, crude pipes, hammers, and rattles designed to cavitate and roar louder than a ship's propellers, would be hurried into widespread use, Foxer, or FXR, later fanfare, and significantly blunt the Gnat threat. By late September, reports of GNAT attacks accelerate. Technical teams in dockyards sketch a blunt answer. If the torpedo homes on the loudest sound, make a louder sound behind the ship and tow it away. The result is the Foxer, a towed noisemaker assembled from hollow steel pipes, loose plates, and engineered cavitation that creates a deafening, fluctuating racket hundreds of meters astern. It works on a simple acoustic principle. The decoy's cavitation masks the frequency and amplitude of the convoy's screws, and the torpedo turns toward the artificial roar and runs itself out. Within weeks, Foxer-type devices, FXR in U.S. service, later the fanfare, are deployed to transatlantic escorts. Field reports are blunt. Foxer saved lives, but it also wounded detection. The device's racket blinded ASDIC or sonar and made it harder to hear other U-boats, and enemy submariners learned to exploit the noise. The human side of the story: men on tired merchant decks jury-rigging floats, hatches, and lines, and sometimes telling tall tales of a cocky cook who suggested using kitchen gear, adds texture and legend. Historians caution: the noisemakers were designed by naval engineers and refined quickly with merchant navy experience. The "cook saves the convoy" version is a powerful narrative device, not the established origin of Foxer. Use that contrast: myth for emotion, Foxer for historic anchor. The first formal trials of the towed noisemaker in mid-October read like wartime improvisation. Dockyard engineers bolted lengths of pipe and rattling plates to canvas floats. Radio rooms logged test frequencies, and captains ordered slow-speed runs to measure how far the racket carried. Within days, operational reports arrived. A destroyer escort in the North Atlantic watched a T-5 turn away from a convoy and detonate harmlessly astern of a Foxer array. Word spread through Admiralty cables that the decoy could divert acoustic seekers on approach vectors where escorting warships had previously been prime targets. Commanders, relieved but cautious, issued hurried instructions. Teach every crew how to rig and tow the device, and practice release procedures for rough seas. A moment felt mechanical and almost absurd, the fate of steel and thousands of lives balanced on the noisy hiss of cavitation produced by simple pipework. Still, the early returns were undeniable. Loss rates dropped when Foxer was used properly, and convoys that adopted the device began to breathe easier. Effectiveness came with a cost. Foxer's booming cavitation masked the mechanical whisper of distant U-boats and rendered ASDIC, or sonar, less effective. The very rattle that lured torpedoes also deafened listening ears. Escort commanders faced a brutal trade. Tow the decoy and blunt GNAT attacks, but accept reduced underwater situational awareness. Or run without it and risk direct acoustic hits on ships and escorts. Tactically, the Allies adapted. Escorts developed rotation patterns, deploying Foxer on vulnerable runs but periodically cutting the device to sweep with ASDIC or to chase radar contacts. Radar and HFDF, or Huff-Duff detection, took on renewed importance. Air cover and aggressive depth charge patterns compensated for temporary sonar blindness. The human element amplified the dilemma. Watchstanders squinted into black seas, knowing the decoy behind the ship might betray other dangers ahead. Admiralty memos catalogued the nuances. At sea, captains learned to balance noise and silence like a sailor balancing ballast, a constant, costly calculus that would shape convoy doctrine for months. In the weeks after Foxer's deployment, the practical and the mythical braided together. In mess decks and wireless rooms, a story circulated. A ship's cook, exasperated with engine noise and afraid for his mates, had suggested cutting kitchen pipework and hurling it astern to make a noise. Soldiers loved the image of a humble cook outwitting a submarine. The tale migrated into newspapers, radio sketches, and later into whispered port lore because it captured something commanders' papers could not: everyday ingenuity under pressure. Reality was less cinematic. Naval architects and ordnance teams designed and specified noisemakers. Crews improvised adjustments and helped mass-produce the arrays. But the Cook story endured because it humanized technology, a way to explain to families back home how lives were being saved without the dry language of Admiralty reports. The myth did what any good legend does. It made a complex countermeasure feel familiar and moral, a small person's victory in a vast war. What began as trial and error in shipyards became in weeks a standardized fleet procedure. Admiralty circulars ordered Foxer-type arrays as part of the escort's kit. Merchant captains were briefed and drill cards printed for night rigging, release, and emergency recovery. Shipwrights refined the floats, chain lengths, and shackles. Dockyards mass-produced the simplest effective components so entire escort groups could fit out between Atlantic crossings. Training films, grainy reels shown in mess halls and at convoy briefings, taught petty officers how to stream the decoy and how to keep the stern clear during combat maneuvers. Supply lines adapted. Pipes, buoys, and spare shackles became as essential as depth charges. At sea, crews moved faster. What started as a clever jury rig now rode behind corvettes and destroyers like a stubby, growling tail. The result was organizational. When the noisemaker was available and crews competent in its use, the pattern of successful GNAT interceptions shifted from isolated miracles to repeatable outcomes. The technology remained crude, but the doctrine hardened. A reminder that wartime invention only wins when it becomes routine. Technology breeds counter-technology. German U-boat skippers and their engineers watched the Allied adoption of decoys and adapted tactics. Some U-boats shifted attack profiles, firing torpedoes from greater standoff ranges, or targeting the flanks of convoys where the decoy's effect dimmed. Intelligence intercepts and captured U-boat logs later showed debate within the Kriegsmarine about whether to alter the acoustic seeker's sensitivity or timing. Attempts were made to tweak the G-7E's homing logic and to test distraction tactics. But redesigning mass-issue torpedoes in wartime proved slow and costly. At the same time, U-boat commanders experimented with salvo patterns, firing spreads and combining acoustic runs with conventional straight runners to overwhelm escorts' choices. The duel became one of adaptation and tempo. Allies sped up production and refined doctrine. Germans tried incremental improvements and tactical shifts. Each new trick at sea pushed both sides into fresh improvisation, a technological chess match played in the roar and spray of the Atlantic. By January 1944, a test of the new doctrine arrived in the form of a hard-month convoy run that would become a quiet turning point. A mixed convoy, battered by winter seas, steamed under the guard of well-drilled escorts, all equipped with Foxer arrays and practiced in rapid rigging. For days, HFDF bearings and coastal air patrols funneled U-boats into predictable approaches. When a wolf pack closed at night, the escorts executed the new choreography. Tow the noisemakers, maintain radar screens, and stagger short sonar sweeps while aircraft kept overhead. The result was not theater fireworks, but survival. Torpedoes found the manufactured roar and detonated harmlessly in the wake, while aggressive depth charge attacks kept shadowing submarines away from the merchant line. Losses that month were measurably lower than in prior runs. Sailors on deck described a strange, guilty relief, saved not by a brilliant single mind, but by coordinated doctrine, noisy decoys, and the stubborn labor of thousands of hands. It was a small, cumulative turn of the tide. A tiny corvette becomes a lens through which the war's contradictions focus. Short, rolling decks and a crew of 30 find themselves on the thin line between merchant safety and submarine fury. On this February night, the corvette's captain orders Foxer streamed at first light after a shadow is picked up by radar. Petty officers lash the floats while stokers bend to the winches, and the ship shudders as cavitation hammers the sea. For the men aboard, there is no romanticism, just procedure and muscle memory. There is also something like guilt when the decoy's scream hides the faint ping of a distant periscope. The corvette's depth charge patterns that night do the unglamorous, brutal work of pushing a hunter away. The convoy's tankers stagger on. In the mess, cigarette smoke and stale tea keep company with relief. The crew knows they have brought hours of voyage for others at the cost of their own hearing, instruments, and a constant mechanical roar in their ears. Back in London, the picture is technical, political, and logistical. Admiralty rooms fill with maps, loss rates, and supply requisitions. A small knot of officers argue doctrine. Is the noisy decoy saving convoys or merely shifting risk? Parliamentary questions about merchant losses meet engineers' memos that speak of manufacturing bottlenecks and alloy shortages for pipework. Meanwhile, Air Command presses for more coastal air cover to reduce the time escorts must rely on Foxer. The result is a multi-pronged push. Prioritize replacement parts, expand instruction films, and lobby aircraft commands for anti-submarine patrols on key routes. The scene is unglamorous, but decisive. Committees, cables, and crate manifests knitting together a practical answer. The war is not decided by a single voice, but by the grinding, patient organization that turns experiments into fleet doctrine. Captured U-boat logs and survivor reports begin to be stitched into a fuller picture. Interrogations of U-boat crews and seized signal books show irritation and fear. Commanders complain that acoustic seekers are losing targets to Allied decoys, while engine room technicians note that salvo tactics are expensive in ordnance and morale. At the same time, merchant logbooks record nights of frantic hauling, damaged rigging from rapid Foxer releases, and routine repairs that sap dockyard capacity. The human ledger is stark. Fewer ship sinkings on routes using decoys, but more exhausted crews, more damaged sonar suites, and a raft of small, costly repairs. Intelligence analysts translate these scattered, noisy testimonies into doctrine refinements. Adjust tow lengths, set rotation windows for ASDIC sweeps, and prioritize corvettes for short-range escorts. The war at sea is becoming a choreography of wear and repair as much as of bullets and torpedoes. Engineers in yards and labs refuse to accept good enough. By March, the Foxer is no longer a single scrap-built item, but a platform for rapid iteration. Acoustic technicians study recordings from trial runs, noting that not all cavitation is equal. Frequency bands, pulse patterns, and transient spikes matter when a homing torpedo parses its target. Shipwrights experiment with pipe diameters, staggered perforations, and linked plates to produce broader spectrum noise that confuses multiple secret types. Float designs are altered to reduce fouling and ice buildup on northern routes, and new shackles let crews stream or jettison the device faster in combat. Admiralty bulletins push these refinements out in weekly circulars. Dockyards stamp out improved kits, while petty officers teach updated rigging drills on training nights. The result is subtle but real. A noisemaker that no longer just screams, but sings a chaotic, shifting chorus, harder for a torpedo's primitive filters to parse, and one that fits into a practiced shipboard routine. A cold April night tests doctrine. A convoy meets a shadowing wolf pack near a fog bank. Radar picks up arcs, and the escort commander faces the old trade-off. He orders Foxer streamed on the outermost corvettes, while destroyers run short ASDIC sweeps in staggered bursts, a choreography of noise and listening. Torpedoes arrive in the gloom. Some veer toward the decoys and detonate harmlessly in the breakers, while others, fired in long spreads, search for quieter paths and strike a lightly laden freighter's stern. The aftermath is mixed. The convoy loses a single merchant, but avoids what could have been a rout. On the bridge, the commander writes a terse log entry, a sober accounting of choices that saved most, but not all. In the mess that night, men exchange hollow jokes and smoke, aware that every tactic carries a cost. The decoy did its job, but only as part of an uneasy orchestration of scarcity, skill, and luck. Not every story fits an admiral's report. Captain Osei, a composite based on multiple merchant captains' logs, offers a human ledger of the Foxer campaign. Years at sea, a wife and children left in port, and a face lined by salt and worry. His log for April 21 is practical. Rig the decoy at dusk, keep an extra winch manned, conserve fuel for evasive turns. He remembers crewmen who lost hearing after months of towing, and recalls nights when frantic signals from a corvette forced him into blind maneuvers. For him, Foxer is neither glory nor magic, but a tool that must be treated with respect, a thing that demands training, maintenance, and a sober hand on the wheel. When young sailors ask why he stays at sea, he answers simply, because the cargo keeps people fed. The camera looks for ordinary acts, securing a lifeboat, tying a child's letter into a pocket, small stitches that hold the convoy's moral cloth together. Harbors groaned like old engines. With Foxer now routine, the pressure shifted ashore. Pipe sections, floats, shackles, and spare buoys flowed through docks at a relentless pace. Cranes lifted pallets of metal into waiting trucks. Stokers, shipwrights, and civilian stevedores worked in wet boots under blackout lamps, while naval clerks wrestled with requisition lists and priority stamps. Repair berths filled with corvettes and escorts that had given up winches, sonar parts, and paint to the campaign. Mechanics cannibalized old ASDIC heads to keep new ones on patrol. Fuel barges queued as convoys adjusted speed to carry the decoy arrays safely. Ice and fouling on northern runs meant more frequent dry docking. Behind the routine files and tired faces lay a stubborn arithmetic. Every Foxer deployed cost dock hours, steel, and men, but each saved tonnage and life made the calculus worthwhile. The message from the ports was plain. Victory at sea demanded a vast, grinding shore effort. Above the convoy, the war took on another dimension. Coastal Command Catalinas and fighter scouts began to patrol longer, pushing U-boats deeper and shortening the windows escorts had to rely solely on Foxer. An early dawn patrol on June 21 found a lurking periscope and vectored in an escort. The aerial observer's terse report, bearing 042, contact maintained, sent a destroyer into a sweep that flushed a U-boat away from the merchant line. Airmen described the sight below: ribbons of foam where decoys trailed, black hulls of freighters riding calm in the gray sea, a flutter of canvas as a rescue boat picked up a man hauled from a shattered skiff. Aircraft changed the calculus at night and in marginal weather. Their presence allowed escorts to cut decoy tow for measured ASDIC sweeps and aggressive hunts. The combined arms of sea and sky tightened the noose around U-boat operations, showing how doctrine fused disparate technologies into coordinated survival. Intelligence and experimentation produced a quieter revolution, better listening. Technicians installed improved hydrophone arrays in escort hulls and experimented with differential listening windows timed between Foxer bursts. A breakthrough came when a petty officer's informal log correlated tiny echo patterns with the presence of shadowing U-boats during very short windows when the decoy was momentarily cut. Analysts in signal rooms began mapping these micro-windows, seconds where the ocean's noise dropped and ASDIC picked up faint returns, and issued new drill cards, staggered tow patterns, brief cut windows, and coordinate aircraft sweeps to fill sensor gaps. The effect was incremental but strategic. Escorts could now force U-boats into compromises, either expose themselves to active hunting during a cut, or attack through a noisy mask with reduced accuracy. The war's acoustic theater had become more nuanced. Noise would deceive, but listening, carefully timed and integrated with air power, would increasingly detect. Mid-July brings a startling windfall. An enemy submarine, mortally wounded by an aggressive destroyer hunt, is forced to surface and is boarded. The captured boat yields more than pride. Officers pry loose components, torpedo spares, and fragments of acoustic seeker circuitry. Photographs and intelligence teams swarm over the hull, tracing wiring and noting hardened parts that sustain deep dives. Most valuable are log entries and engineering notes that confirm what Allied technicians had suspected about frequency windows and homing thresholds. Analysts match those records to hydrophone logs and refine tow patterns, while ordnance officers adjust counter-decoy protocols based on captured parts. For sailors below decks, the impact is visceral. A tangible reminder that theory and practice meet in metal and grease, and that a single seizure can ripple into new tactical doctrines. The capture also feeds public morale, newspaper pages thick with proud headlines, even as officers whisper that the war's gains arrive at the cost of many small, anonymous sacrifices. The campaign's quieter billboards are physiological. By August, medical officers document rising cases of hearing loss, tinnitus, and nerve fatigue among sailors who have towed Foxer arrays for months. Ship surgeons stitch up hands and treat deck injuries, but clinic logs show a deeper wound. Men whose lives ashore are altered by a constant ringing that no doctor can fully erase. Letters from home arrive folded into shirts. Some wives plead to have husbands reassigned from towing duties, while port unions press for compensation and better ear protection. Admiralty memos nudge dockyards to supply earplugs and to consider rotation policies. Investigators test noise-dampening collars and modified winch placements. The human ledger tilts toward compromise. Technology buys distance from torpedoes and time for convoys, yet exacts a personal toll that is recorded in pension claims and in the coughs and quiet conversations in later years. The story of Foxer, then, is also the story of the men who paid for its success in ways that rarely make headlines. By late September, the noisy decoy has moved from emergency improvisation to codified doctrine. Training establishments include Foxer rigging in seamanship courses. Simulated night exercises rehearse staggered tow cuts and coordinated aircraft timing. Admiralty manuals print standard tow lengths and emergency jettison procedures. Meanwhile, the tactics honed for Atlantic convoys reverberate into other theaters. Arctic runs, Mediterranean supply lines, and the approaches to Allied occupied ports adopt variant arrays suited to local conditions. The logistical machine grinds on. Catalogues of parts, standardized repair protocols, and a doctrine that prefers combined arms, air, radar, HFDF, and controlled noise over any single silver bullet. Church bells ring for sunk comrades, even as dockyard whistles call men back to work. The noisy wake of Foxer becomes part of a larger institutional memory, an example of how simple physics, frantic improvisation, and bureaucratic follow-through can, together, save tonnage and lives. An autumn docket convenes a sober audit. Admiralty analysts compile months of convoy returns, loss rates, hydrophone logs, and dockyard reports into a blunt ledger. The noisemaker campaign shows clear marks. Convoys employing Foxer and coordinated air cover suffer significantly fewer catastrophic acoustic hits than those that do not. But the review is not a triumphal memo. It is a set of hard lessons. The decoy's interference with ASDIC, the strain on dockyards, the human costs of prolonged noise exposure, and the enemy's tactical tweaks. Recommendations are precise and bureaucratic. Standardized tow lengths tied to escort class. Rotation windows for sonar sweeps, prioritized part shipping routes, and fresh limits on continuous tow durations for any individual ship. Admiralty minutes, dry and decisive, also seed future research priorities: quieter decoys, better hydrophone sensitivity, and coordinated air-sea timing. The review reframes Foxer from emergency invention into an instrument to be improved, budgeted, and taught, a quiet turning of improvisation into policy. Among the official files sits a folded letter from a third steward on a convoy freighter dated November 2. The handwriting is small and steady. He writes of the endless roar at the stern, of nights when men lashed themselves to winches to stream the decoy, of a mate who lost hearing and still whistled in the dark. Yet he writes also of small mercies, a rescued baby wrapped in a blanket, a kettle that never went cold on a freezing dawn, the soft way a captain folded shore leave orders into a pocket. We make noise to steal the sea's bite, he writes, and in the noise we keep each other. The letter is ordinary and terrible. It compresses policy and port logs into a human measure of cost and care. When archivists later find it in an Admiralty bundle, they note that the intangible ledger of courage and endurance is as crucial to the campaign's memory as the charts and memos. As 1944 closes, thinkers and technicians begin to ask what the Foxer story means beyond the war. Laboratories that tuned decoys now turn to quieter problems: active sonar refinement, frequency analysis, and post-war applications of underwater acoustics for research and commerce. Naval institutes gather captured diagrams and trial logs. Universities offer papers on cavitation and spectral masking. Corporations see peacetime uses, surveying, oil exploration, and safer navigation, while veterans lobby for hearing care and pensions. The tactical lesson endures. Simple physics, sound, masking, and timing reshaped an entire theater of war. But the human lesson is equally persistent. Innovation at sea was as much social as technical. crews who towed, engineers who tuned, clerks who filed the memos, and their work left both a material legacy in manuals and an audible one in the ringing ears of survivors. The Foxer era closes as a case study in how necessity, improvisation, and bureaucracy combine to change the soundscape of conflict and peace.
The first winter of 1945 feels like a slow audit of everything that was built in haste. Shipwrights in northern yards replace battered shackles and refit winches. Petty officers file after-action notes into growing repositories of tacit knowledge. Veterans travel home on leave and carry with them small proofs of the campaign, a dented length of pipe saved as a memento, an insurance receipt for a damaged ASDIC head, or a faded drill card thumbed to the point of disintegration. In naval clubs and seaside pubs, the technical lexicon becomes folklore, foxer, GNAT, fanfare, words that sound like places where men once went to work and did not always come back the same. Archivists later will find those metal scraps and dog-eared manuals as the raw materials of institutional memory. Men who towed the decoys will carry less tangible marks. Tonitis, a stiffer step, a name recalled that reunions with a mixture of pride and sorrow. The campaign's artifacts sit uneasily between invention and injury. The quiet work of cataloging them begins.
As victory draws nearer, the noise itself softens in the record, but not in the ears of those who towed. Post-action committees meet to recommend peacetime care. Hearing clinics are proposed, pension boards briefed, and naval museums asked for artifacts. Some crews receive commendations for seamanship. Dockyard foremen are named in dispatches for production feats. Yet historians and veterans advocates will later remark on the asymmetry of recognition. Engineering corps and frontline pilots often receive public fanfare, while the anonymous sailors who towed hours of deafening cavitation find only modest mentions in wartime chronicles. The campaign's final ledger is mixed. Tonnage saved, lives spared, but a scattering of unmarked sacrifices whose voices persist in letters, reunion speeches, and a few quiet plaques in small ports. The war's last acoustic is a moral question. How do you tally the price of a noisy success? And how do you remember the people who paid it?
The cook, call him by no single name, for he is part myth and part composite, exists at the intersection of story and policy. In wartime oral histories, he is pictured as bluntly practical, a man who bent a kitchen pipe, or who watched engine room rhythms and suggested an offset noise. In archival records, he is a stand-in for countless merchant seamen and ratings who improvised and assisted naval engineers. His life before the noise was ordinary and necessary. Long shifts in galley heat, letters to a wife, the small domestic economies of seafarers. During the campaign, he was, in legend, the origin of an idea that saved lives. In reality, he represents the practical ingenuity of crews who adapted equipment, lashed improvised floats, and kept Foxers streaming in the worst weather. After the war, many such men returned to civilian docks, some carrying hearing damage, others quietly proud but rarely celebrated. Impact then, the Cook legend humanized a technical countermeasure, giving the public an emotive narrative, a small person outsmarting a machine. Practically, merchant crews' improvisations and feedback were invaluable in refining Foxer designs and rigging practices. Impact now,
The story endures in port lore, reunion speeches, and a handful of popular retellings that prefer the human spark to dry Admiralty prose. Yet formal recognition is thin. Unlike test pilots, many of these seafarers received only routine medals or no public honors at all. Their medical aftercare and hearing compensation were often limited by post-war bureaucracy. What recognition exists and what should have been done better? Existing: scattered mentions in naval histories, a few dockside plaques in small ports, and personal medals for exceptional seamanship. Oral histories preserve the cooktail in mess deck memory. What should have been done? A coordinated program of recognition and care. Official plaques listing the names of merchant crews who served in anti-GNAT roles. Dedicated exhibits in naval and maritime museums explaining both the technology and its human cost. State-funded hearing clinics and priority pensions for sailors whose service involved prolonged exposure to decoy noise, and formal inclusion of merchant seamen's technical contributions in educational curricula and public commemoration events. A national memorial display, not just to admirals and captains, but to the mechanics, cooks, stokers, and petty officers, would tell a fuller, truer story. Final image of the cook, not simply the man who invented a trick, but the emblem of practical courage, a reminder that technical victories are woven from countless small hands and everyday ideas. If history remembers him as a myth, it should also honor the reality behind the myth, the crews who towed, tuned, and repaired the noisy wake that saved convoys. A fitting end would be to make that memory visible: plaques, pensions, curated artifacts, and listening clinics, so the ringing in their ears is not the last witness we leave to their work.